Hi everyone, and welcome to Mystery Esoterica. And my name is Braden, and what we're going to talk about today is the sacred story. We talked about this briefly in my intro video last week. Now, what is the deal with the sacred story? If you remember, the sacred story is I die, I'm born, I live. I die, I'm born, and I live. Which is very different from what Western society says. And Western society kind of gets it backwards. We say, I'm born, therefore I live, therefore I die. I'm born, therefore I live, therefore I die. That's because in Western society, being able to see equals knowing. I see, therefore I know. In occult teachings and esoteric knowledge, this is actually wrong. The emphasis isn't put on seeing, the emphasis is put on knowing. So I know, therefore I see. So you can have like a little light bulb over here. I know, therefore I see. And the reason the light bulb is always important, why we use this a lot, is because knowing and knowledge is always synonymous with light. Knowing equals light. So, with this in mind, when we look in mythology and we look in stories, things that take away your ability to see light, to be able to see, to be able to know, are synonymous with ignorance. Whoops. These are synonymous with ignorance. Oops. There we go. Just so you guys know, I cannot spell. You do not expect me to be able to spell well. It's just not going to happen. Ignorance. So this is the polar opposite of knowing. Death, blindness, and sleep, because they take away the light, are synonymous with ignorance. Okay? So, you have this two dueling symbols here. You have darkness and light. Darkness, light. So when we look at our sacred story, I die, I'm born, I live. You could see this journey. Death equals darkness. This is, I don't know, therefore I don't live. But when I begin to learn and know sacred knowledge, I start taking a journey into the light. It's interesting that Jesus was always called the Word of God. Or in the Greek, it's called the Logos. And this word logos doesn't just show up in the Bible over and over again. It also shows up in, for some reason my pen isn't working. It shows up in all kinds of places, including other esoteric writings. And the logos always, always, always brings the light. So to know the Word of God, to hear what He says, is the light bringer. Truth is the light bringer. So you're born in darkness. Remember, the emphasis, I'm having problems with my pen. I'm trying to use my finger. The emphasis is on knowing first, therefore I see. Remember? So with this in mind, I don't know, therefore I'm dead. But I begin to learn, I begin to know. I see the light. Sorry, I'm just going to have to use my finger. I keep trying to make my pen work, but it's just not happening. This is born, not burn. I'm born because I begin to see the light of Gnosis. Gnosis just means knowledge, sacred knowledge. Therefore, I live because I know. So there's kind of a hidden esoteric statement. Esoteric, if you remember, comes from the Greek word esoterikos. I'm sorry, I think maybe it's Latin, which means hidden knowledge. So there's this esoteric statement. Seeing is believing. Most people would see this as I am physically seeing. I'm physically seeing something in the real world. Like I physically see a bag of chips, so I believe in a bag of chips. Where to the mystery schools, this word here is quite different. This word right here means knowing. I have knowledge of the sacred wisdom. And this this pattern is kind of difficult. And this is why it's difficult to teach some of this stuff, is because you have layers of symbolism, which we're going to get into right now, where knowledge, it's not as easy to do with my finger. Knowledge is symbolized by light, or I should say sacred knowledge. Knowing how to make toast isn't going to cut it. Is also symbolized by your brain. A functioning, balanced brain. You have two hemispheres of your brain. You have neocortex, two parts of a neocortex. And if these are balanced, or in unity, it's if you take a picture of a brain that's thinking, that's a functioning, working brain, that's thinking hard about something, it lights up like a Christmas tree. So your brain, your mind, is synonymous with light as well. And because the lights are on, you can see. Sorry, that looks creepy, but really it's just because I'm using my finger. And being able to see keeps you alive. Alright. And seeing is synonymous again with knowledge. So any of these things here in a little list are used interchangeably in occult traditions. Sometimes it's your brain, sometimes it's seeing, sometimes it's the sun. And the thing that you need to keep in mind is each one of these things represents all of these at once. And that's the part that's really difficult to teach, is because there's a lot of commingled, like a web of symbols that all mean the same thing, and that web of symbols connects to other symbols and knowledge bases too. Trying to teach, you almost have to teach everything all at once, all at the same time, which could be very difficult. So if we look at, there's a very common type of myth. It's called, I'm going to turn my pen again, see if it works. Called the myth of the dying god. There's a lot of versions of this, but there's a few things that all dying god myths have in common. Typically, the dying god always represents the sun, and the most common one, specifically in the dying god myths where there's where it's an actual god who's actually dying, because there's a lot of dying god myths where, like a good example would be Jacob's Ladder would qualify as a dying god myth, or sometimes you could call it the Gnosis myth. Gnosis, again, meaning sacred knowledge, where he doesn't actually die. Odin, the god Odin, doesn't die in his Gnosis getting myth. However, there are a set of gods, like Adonis. Adonis. Boulder. If you're a Norse fan. Quetzalcoatl. I can't even begin to spell that, so we're just going to sound it out. Quetzalcoatl. I totally understand that's not spelled right. We're just going to have to deal with it. Alright, Tammuz is a sun god. Christ is a sun god. Mithra is a sun god. And all these have a fairly interesting overarching arc. So each one of these gods does something fairly interesting. See, now my pen's not working again. They all have a fairly interesting story arc. Oh, and there's another one. I'll think of it. Osiris, that's what it was. Osiris is another one. They live their lives of knowledge. You ever wonder why in old paintings they always give the saints a halo? That's why. Because they have divine knowledge. That's what the halo represents. And then they live their lives of knowledge. Then they are always murdered by something or someone that doesn't know any better. In the case of Adonis, he was murdered by a wild boar. Boulder was murdered by Hob, or Hod, I think it was Hob. The blind god. Remember what we said about blindness? Alrighty. Osiris. I don't think you could say that Set didn't know any better, but Set was the god of darkness. Osiris was murdered by Set. Christ was murdered by the pagan Romans. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. They do not know. They do not know equals blindness. There's supposed to be an L in there. So already we have Hob, the blind god. We have Set, god of darkness. The Romans don't know. The boar represents the underworld. The reason it's represented by the underworld is because it represents the bestial nature of man. If you think of your brain, it's kind of a picture of your brain. You have kind of the lower parts down here. You have the upper parts up here. The neocortex is up here, and then down here you have the middle brain and the Abdullah, which constitutes the lower world, bestial nature of man, or darkness. Sometimes it's just called lower consciousness. Low consciousness. And each and every one of these things represents ignorance. I should say that a lot of these things that we're looking at right here are very similar. Oh, come on, pen. This pen's driving me crazy. To the Gnosis stories, or kind of a subsection of the dying god myths, where you have like Adam in the Bible who fell asleep, and you had the Jacob and his ladder. Jacob fell asleep, and you have there's just a bunch of them. There's a bunch of them. Anytime Samson is another one. He falls asleep and he loses his hair. And Samson, we're talking about the sun and light, by the way. Samson actually means sun. So when Delilah cut his hair, the rays of the sun were taken away and he fell into darkness. And actually in the story, they actually capture him at this point and pluck out his eyes. You kind of get a double whammy with Samson. But what's interesting with all these dying god myths is something happens. The god always wakes up. He sees the light. All right? So what does this mean? What does this mean to wake up? Well, to wake up means you're being born. Remember? First you die, then you're born, then you live. I need to remind you, because I cannot pound this point home enough, I need to remind you that we're talking about the primary focus behind all the esoteric doctrines. All the esoteric doctrines is consciousness. Consciousness or sacred knowledge. This is primary. All the stories, all the symbols come back to this. All right. So it is never, ever, ever talking about your physical body. When we're talking about immortality, we're talking about this or this. All right. It's never concerning itself with your physical body. In most circles, the only thing that they really care about, that they really want your physical body to be in good shape for, is so that you're nourishing your brain so that you can obtain this. It's not because they actually want your body to be like in athletic fighting condition. What they really want is your brain to be in athletic condition. And here's the thing. This is the secret of secrets. This is what no one will ever tell you. And it is my hope that you really, truly take the time to ponder this point. The myth of the dying god is written about and for you. You are the myth of the dying god. The way the story goes, you remember, you fell into ignorance. But you can be born into the sacred knowledge of all ages, and you can live forever. Remember, we're not talking about your physical body. This is pure silliness. This is just pure silliness. We're not talking about your physical body. We're talking about your spirit. Your spirit, or your consciousness. Right? Your brain. Well, I shouldn't say your brain. The thing that powers your brain, that gives it oomph. I'm talking about this. Lives forever. This is your story. And the reason I say you live forever, this doesn't come from nowhere. This is my last point before we finish up. The creator of all things is big. And there is nothing outside of him. If you're a Christian, or you've been to church, or at least you have some idea of some of these ideas, you're probably familiar with this idea of an entity that is infinite, that has created everything. So there's nothing outside of him. Just darkness. And now this is a bit of a handicap. Unlike you and I, who can go cut down a tree, build a house, pick food from the wild and eat it for sustenance, the creator of all things does not have this luxury. There is physically nothing outside of himself for which he can create. So, the creator of all things must use his mind. This is called the principle of mentalism. If you've ever read any books on Hermeticism, Hermeticists, this is one of their primary principles. It's called the principle of mentalism. And this means that the universe is mental. So, all things exist in the mind of the all. You exist in the mind of the all. So does your dog, and your parents, and your car. All things exist in this infinite mind. So, this means that the difference between that, basically what I'm saying is, you and the great mind itself all share the same mind. You both occupy the same mind space. And my pen's having trouble again. You both occupy the same mind space. Which means you and the y'all are the same. You and God are the same being. The difference between you and the all is simply a matter of degree. You are small. The all is infinite. So, this, and not everyone is comfortable with this term, this makes you, my friends, a god. A god. You know, if it makes you feel better, what we'll do is we'll just, let's put this little g, so you feel better. Okay, this makes you a god. This makes you a god that fell into darkness. You're blind. You can't see. You're dead. You've fallen asleep. You were murdered by ignorance. But you get to be awakened by the light. Here's our little light bulb again. Because of that light, you get to live again. And this light, don't forget, is a sacred knowledge. The knowledge of your own divinity, the knowledge of God itself, sacred knowledge. All right, my friends, this is going to wrap up this segment. The next segment, we will actually dig into a couple of these myths. We're going to probably look at Boulder, and we'll probably look at Christ, because everyone has heard of Christ, and we'll see if we have time for a few others. But there's a few of these that all of this that we've just covered, it's all symbolically represented fairly clearly. All right. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You guys are awesome, and talk to you all later.